Recording.
So, as the director of the Columbian Pike Documentary Project, you and your team have documented the photos and stories of Columbia Pike residents. Since 2007, Columbia Pike is well known for being one of the most diverse neighborhoods in the country. There are people from more than 130 countries speaking at least 100 languages living in the area. Columbia Pike has gotten the name for being the world in a zip code. Your team is diverse as well, including backgrounds such as Syrian, Vietnamese, Laotian, Japanese, Indian, etc. However, the area was not always diverse. When you were growing up in Arlington as a kid, there were three major groups in Arlington: Southern white, Southern black, and government workers. Your family was in the latter, as you mentioned in your interview, and when you attended high school, there were a few Cubans, a few Jews, and a couple of embassy kids. Now things have clearly changed. Could you talk about when you first started noticing the demographics of Arlington shifting? What different groups did you notice arriving in the area?
Thank you. In the 1970s, when I moved to Arlington from nearby Fairfax County, the big group that had just started coming was Vietnamese, right at the end of the war there, after Saigon fell to the communist regime. And they came very rapidly, and Cambodians and Hmong people and some Lao people also, very visible. I actually remember the first time I saw Vietnamese people. It was not in Arlington, but across the river, and there were all these people in traditional. It was within 2 or 3 days after the fall of Saigon. There were these people staring at the buildings, and then I started seeing in the community. I was teaching in the high school by that point, what's now H.B. Woodlawn and Career Center, where there were also a fair number of Cubans. There were also a fair number of Koreans coming, and enough that there were people who called the Career Center the Korea Center. There were all kinds of social service programs as well as kids in classes. But the big numbers were Vietnamese. I remember having a Cambodian girl in my class, Phala Chan, and I sometimes think about her now because it was must have been right after the Pol Pot genocides there, and she was just this very positive, sweet, pretty teenage girl, and what she must have seen and gone through. The Vietnamese quickly set up businesses, mostly in the Clarendon area. There were a few other areas, but there were a lot there. It was visibly Vietnamese. I remember thinking at a Tet Festival I photographed in probably about 78, 79, I wonder what this is going to look like in 30 years. And I don't think they do Tet Festivals here anymore. You know, the communities move further out into Fairfax County and Loudoun County, etc. And the people were very traditional looking. You only heard Vietnamese at that time. Though 2 of our photographers in our team are of Vietnamese background. So there are still some folks here, but the big numbers change. Then, I don't remember exactly the year, but I had a student who was not Latina, who I guess had a boyfriend who was, and she got very involved with the El Salvadorian community probably around 1980. With the troubles in Central America, there started to be a lot of El Salvadorians coming here. And you started seeing them I was still teaching in the school system. A handful of Bolivians too, but just a few. And some people from South Asia also, but the big numbers you would see were the Central Americans fleeing unrest, warfare and poverty. I didn't have that many in my classes. I just started seeing people about, and through my student, Hannah, I began to get a sense of them. But I didn't have as much interaction as I do now.
That's interesting. And do you remember what sort of barriers were present that newly arrived immigrants had to overcome during 1976 to 1990?
I can talk about a specific kid, Nam Ung, who was a student of mine at the Career Center. We knew he was over the age of 18, but he needed to get an education. let's just say the other teacher and I just, Paul Endo, and I just looked the other way, as did the administration. It was like, let's pretend, he didn't want to get dulled at, he wanted a high school degree. And he was training for a career, which he later went into. There was a pretty distinct language issue. I know because I became close to him. He had trouble with his parents with language. His father had been a white collar worker, bureaucrat in Vietnam. Here he was pushing a broom at the hospitals. It's work, but not up to the kind of abilities he had, and it was a language issue. And there was they went from a middle class status to poverty, or near poverty. They recovered. Nam did well for himself, and his kids are grown now. They were all born here. But we would see this, with newly arrived people. Same with the Latino folks that we knew. I didn't know them as well, but the Vietnamese people I knew. Language was a big one, and I heard stories later from other people and also from Nam about discrimination they suffered, for not being native white American.
Wow. And do you recall any services that were provided to the newly arrived immigrants, particularly during the years of 1976 to 1990? Was there any community support?
I know a little, but that I know less about than some other things. I know the Career Center had housed there quite a number of immigrant services, mostly ESL. I know the county was very active in providing ASL to new immigrants. Housing and other social services I only know slightly. My ex-wife was a county social worker. Actually, her department head was a Vietnamese woman. This is in that period you're talking about. And I know that there was outreach, particularly to the Southeast Asian community provided by the county, but I have no direct knowledge. I mean, I would just hear from her or see, and I knew from the school system that there was outreach for them, but I don't know, particularly on housing and jobs, what availability there was.
And you mentioned how your Arlington documentary project started in bits in 1979. You also noted how, due to the growing presence of Amazon and major development projects, the demographics of Arlington have been changing during the past 10 years, and you're already noticing a difference. The middle class is shrinking, securing affordable housing is difficult, and ethnic diversity is diminishing. In other words, there is gentrification happening, and you fear that the Pike will become a lot wealthier and a lot more generic. Could you compare the demographic landscape of Arlington in 1979 when you first started documenting the area versus today?
Yeah, as I've said before, I moved to Arlington in 1975-ish because it was cheap. The population had been declining or stable. There was a lot of housing, inexpensive. There was wealthy people in the county too, but there was a lot. The big thing I noticed, there's a lot of white working class, or mid-level government workers, teachers, cops, carpenters, plumbers, and the like could afford to live here. There was a stable black community that still mostly lived in the enclaves that they had to live in during the pre-civil rights era, that hadn't moved out yet. I mean, like I said, and you quoted me, that it was pretty much in the beginning Southern white government workers and Southern black. That began to change, and particularly with the Vietnamese coming in. There was a wealthy part of the community, which is sort of north of what is now Langston Boulevard. It was Lee Highway at the time. And then there were, even like Westover had lots of affordable housing. Buckingham, which is North Arlington, there's still some. The Pike was naturally affordable, the whole area. So people moved here. It's pretty safe. There's relatively low crime. There were jobs here and there were jobs in the city close by. The white population began moving out. In retrospect, starting in the 80s, some of it I've been told by people I knew that they just felt less comfortable, which apply to certain kind of racism, unconscious perhaps, but there, somebody said it just doesn't feel familiar anymore. It was a very, it was I used to describe Arlington as a very big, small town. And then I remember the county started billing itself as being urban, and I remember being kind of surprised and a little bit upset by that, whereas it had been suburban. It started getting, the built areas it really built up were confined really to Roslyn and Crystal City, now National Landing. And realtors decided to give it a new name for the corporation. The county's distinctly wealthier, and I think that we peaked in our diversity some years ago. I think it's not, it's still very diverse in segments, very diverse, and we're in one of them right now. But it's changing and it's visible to me. I think very little, except for there are some places along Langston Boulevard that have still some, immigrant businesses that are going to stay there, I hope. But the built area, heavily built and expensive, extends out to Clarendon, and I see that the Pike has got areas where that's happening, and Langston Boulevard seems to be on the chopping block now. When people start saying, "Oh, we're going to have new vision for the community," that usually means the businesses are going to start. We're going to get tall buildings and corporatization. That's been my observation, and less economic. My worries are more about changing economic diversity than ethnic, because the tech business, frankly, is pretty diverse. It's a different diversity than we have had, but I do see that in the period we're talking about, there was some movement out of the traditional African American African American neighborhoods, partly because they had the opportunities to, and they had, some of them were getting good paying jobs, and they didn't. One woman said to me, a lot of people didn't want to live in grandpa's old handmade house that was kind of not meeting code and could live somewhere else, and did. And then, it just, prices just get bid up. Just look at the house. I mean, it's almost it is common knowledge in the county that would become expensive. Whereas back then, not so much. Young families could, with a little help from family or on their own, often buy a small home in Arlington and, stay there and raise a family. It's more difficult now.
Yeah, I mean, that's unfortunate to hear that it's becoming, much less affordable. And do you know what it was like navigating affordable housing for various communities during the years of 1976 to 1990?
Only anecdotally. That I bought a house. I think we stopped renting and bought a house around 1980, 81. To give you an idea, we moved out of Cherrydale because the house was $100,000, and we thought that was too much for that house. So we moved to Glen Carlin and bought a house for nearly $100,000, but it was in perfect shape. And I don't think you could buy a driveway in Arlington for $100,000 now, and part of that's general inflation. But in the relationship of level of income to housing costs has gotten much higher. I had students who were living in Arna Valley and other areas that were more affordable, but I was dealing with high school kids mostly, and their parents were talking about affordability, not them. So I don't have any direct knowledge as you asked.
No, but thank you for providing that context and that information. And speaking of diversity, you come from a Jewish background. You noted in an interview that your father is from Germany and he escaped the Nazis. Could you talk about both of your parents' backgrounds and how that shaped your identity and your view of the world growing up?
The latter part is hard. My father came here as a refugee from Frankfurt am Main in Germany in the late 30s. It got bad for them there. I mean, it was quite literally a case of life or death at that point. They left late because his father had a couple of stores, and he was also a veteran of the German army, or Austro-Hungarian army, fighting with the Germans in World War I, and it galled him that the Nazis didn't consider him German. They left late. Other parts of the family, the ones that got out, left earlier, the younger ones. He came here in spring of 1937 in his mid-teens. His mother died actually within a week or two of them arriving here, not of Nazi-related stuff, of cancer. He didn't think he was going to be able to go to college because they lost all their money. The Nazis expropriated basically whatever wealth the family had. They were a comfortable middle-class family as far as I can tell. And then long story short, he got drafted to fight in World War II, was back in Frankfurt as an American soldier during the war. We had pretty much bombed it flat. His neighborhood hadn't been touched. His unit opened Ohrdruf, which was a sub-camp of Buchenwald, one of the Nazi concentration camps. Saw the miseries there. And then because we afforded mostly white soldiers, GIs, the GI Bill, he was able to afford college, became an engineer, got involved with computers in the early 50s. We moved a lot, ended up in Virginia in the early mid-60s. He was very strongly Jewish, but very secular. Most of his family had gone to Israel, South America, Sweden, the ones that got out. I didn't know until I was in my 40s that quite a few had been killed or died by suicide rather than be taken. My mother was born here. Her parents came from a small village called Bachov in the region, in what was then Austria-Hungary. It's now Poland, near a city called Przemysl, which has got a lot of consonants in it. I visited there. They were from a traditional background. They emigrated because basically poverty and oppression came to the U.S. Her parents are both from the same village. Classic New York Jewish, Yiddish speaking. Her mother died when she was little. He had a little grocery store. He only had a 6th grade education, though very well read. My mother, between her mom's death and that they didn't train Jewish women, didn't get a lot of Jewish education. I was raised, I was sent to synagogue for training, had a bar mitzvah. I'm sort of more identified than they were. I think it skipped a generation. The German side of me feels very strong, though my grandparents came from, if you've ever seen Fiddler on the Roof, that's the world they came from. Though it wasn't Tsarist Russia, wasn't quite as bad as that. But that was, so there's this Yiddish-speaking side, and the secular German, modern European side that was mostly what I was raised in that world. Science, reason, European arts forms were prized. And we lived in Europe for a little while when I was a kid. My dad was stationed in Holland, working for SHAPE, which is part of NATO. So we moved a lot before we came to Virginia.
That's so interesting. And do you remember what it was like being Jewish in the Nova area, near Arlington, when you were growing up?
Well, when I first moved here, it was during the centenary of the Civil War, so early, 64, 65, somewhere in there. I was kind of shocked at how big a deal the Civil War was still here. Because the last place we lived in New Jersey was, like, I think we got a little bit in the history class. That was it. It wasn't on people's minds. I was, being Jewish was a non-issue pretty much. Though I did for the first time run into anti-Semitism directed at me by other kids. It was called names, set pennies pitched at me, spit at. Wasn't very often. I remember my father was very upset when he found this out because he thought it had gone away. By the time I hit high school, it was kind of a non-issue, other than the occasional evangelical Christian trying to convert me, which I always found bizarre. It wasn't very hard to deal with. I mean, by and large, it was a non-issue. You know, I was accepted at school. I was successful in school. I don't ever remember it coming up with teachers or most of my friends. It was later. In fact, it was kind of later, largely dealing with my father, not talking about what had happened in Europe, that I became curious and started doing more issues on my route. Growing up in Arlington, it's been a zero issue. You know, it's my father used to talk more about things he had experienced in World War II, with how he saw black soldiers treated, and seeing that, not locally, this was in other places. And then I was in one of the first Boy Scout troops that was integrated in the state, and I felt a lot of empathy with the black kids in my classes, in my troop, and then in school.
Well, I'm sorry about the kids, but I spit on you, but I'm also glad that, it was mainly a non-issue for the most part.
And actually, one of those guys who spit at me had forgotten about it, and we became friends years later. I never said anything to him. He had probably completely forgot about it.
Wow. And you note how Arlington is a blend of cultures, how people get along, and diversity is valued, appreciated, and celebrated. You noted that the differences don't divide but unite. You also stated this is what peace looks like. It's not perfect, but by and large, the groups interact well. You've heard immigrants say, I don't feel different here because everybody is different. You noted what you and your team have captured over the last 15 years shows that everyone who lives in Columbia Pike deserves praise for building a welcoming, vibrant, and diverse community. You were quoted stating, it's a vision of what the world could be. I think there's some joy and strength, and it's something to be proud of for what we've done here. While there is coexistence among the community, could you recall any instances during the years of 1976 to 1990 where there was either lack of harmony among the various communities or between certain communities and government and law enforcement?
I can't speak between government and law enforcement, though I've heard some anecdotes, and it's actually after the time you spoke of. One of our former county board members, who's Latino, got pulled over by a county cop, not recognizing who he was, and it was basically racism. I mean, I've had that happen. It's after this time. I got pulled over after 9/11. I was up in North Arlington. It was totally obvious what was going on, that they thought I was Middle Eastern. And I, having grown up here, I responded to the cop with I started talking like this to him, which is how people spoke when I grew up here. And he was a little surprised, and the ticket got thrown. The county returned. He wrote me a ticket. I hadn't done anything wrong. I knew he was just pulling me over because he thought I was terrorist potential. They're like, go give me a break. That was in 2001. That short little period right after the attacks on the Pentagon. A little later than this. I had the Vietnamese kids talk to me about the struggles, particularly their parents had. And they did not share directly with me stuff. I know I had some black students at Career Center who would talk about some of the issues they had. and they mostly had gotten their training from their parents of how to deal with, what we would now call white supremacy. It wasn't spoken about. Once in a while, they would say something, or there'd be a photograph that we would be discussing that they'd made, and some of those issues would come up. Then most of those kids lived in what is Halls Hill and Green Valley. And there was, it wasn't a topic of conversation that much. And I was not as aware. I personally, and my co-teacher, who was Japanese American, did our best to work to help them, but I wasn't as aware as I am now, and I probably could have been more proactive. Same thing with some of the gay students I had. I was pretty good at deflecting anti-gay speech directed at them, but I wasn't as supportive looking back as proactive about as I probably should have been.
Interesting. And you mentioned stories, being in Arlington, such as going to a Turkish kebab place on the Pike, and the waiter asked you where you're from, and you proceeded to tell him that you're Jewish and your father's from Germany, and you knew the waiter was from Eastern Turkey, and he proceeded to tell you that he's a Kurdish Jew. In another instance, you were photographing a woman you thought was Latina, but turned out to be a Moroccan Jewish woman. You also
No, she wasn't Jewish.
Oh, she wasn't Jewish.
She was Moroccan.
Oh, my bad.
Just Moroccan.
My bad.
It's
well,
okay.
Luckily, it's going to be cut off. My voice is going to
Okay.
You also noted that you're acquainted with a Mongolian rocket scientist, and that is a rare instance to find if you're outside of Mongolia. Is there any other interesting story you would like to share about meeting people in Arlington, specifically during the years of our timeline?
The timeline is harder because some of the things you mentioned are a little after. Yeah. The rocket scientist, he's now living in the district he was living in on the Pike, and we had photographed him, an intern and I, and I just started talking to him. He says, what's your background? He goes, I'm a Mongolian rocket scientist. There's more than one of you. And yes, there are. And he contracts with the Pentagon. And I think he was the first Mongolian person that I knew that I'd met, and that was like, I thought somebody had said to me as a young person, you would be meeting and knowing Mongolians. I thought they were crazy. It was a closed country at the time, until after 1990, the fall of the Soviet Union. Now they travel. There's so many people during that time that I met. I think of the janitor at the school I used to work at, we used to call him a swamp Billy. He was from the swamps, a white guy, very poor background from South Carolina, and he was just a hardworking, decent man, Billy Holzberg, and pulled himself up, came to Arlington, got himself a government job, right? And we became friends, learning about his life. I think it's a couple of the teachers that I knew, Doris Pulliam, African-American woman who had made something of herself, was a very successful and well-loved educator. I believe they've both passed on. I know Doris has passed on. Most of the people I was meeting at that time were my students. And then I would say, actually, someone who was a co-worker, who's still a dear friend, was Paula Endo, who she and her husband Todd are Japanese American. Both of them were interned as children during the Second World War. The West Coast Japanese were put in camps. They were both very strong believers in equal rights for everybody. Todd actually went to Selma to march during that era. He was also very involved with housing and immigrant issues. A lot of my work with immigrant issues came through working through Paula, particularly. Two of the photographers on our current team grew out, who were Vietnamese background, grew out of a program Paula ran at the old Arlington Mill for mostly immigrant kids. Paula was like my big sister. She's still alive, but she's retired. Influenced me a lot. She says I influenced her a lot, but I think it was more me that got it from her. And she's very deeply involved with community, and I sort of absorbed naturally that concern. It seemed healthy to me, and she'd just go, "Come on, let's do this thing together." Or I would have an idea, and she would say, "Let's include so and so." And I think, given my background, I always felt more comfortable when there were lots of diverse people around, rather than when I was young. To get back partially to an earlier question, one of my dear high school friends, who I'm still close to, all my friends were white Protestant, or white Christian, not all Protestant kids, and growing up. And one of the gals, so there's a group of us who are still close, asked me at one point, "You weren't all into all that Jewish stuff when we were kids or young adults." I said, "Were you?" And I said to her, truthfully, "Well, not so much. I was, as a teenager, you're worried about being cool and fitting in, right? And there wasn't, the Jewish kids in my high school as a group we all knew who each other was, but we didn't hang out as a group. I knew some of them from synagogue, but many of them were not from religious families. Anyway, so I told my friend, no, truthfully. But what I didn't say to her, and I never have, and I probably won't, was, and if I had been that strongly identified and out about those parts of my life, I'm not sure you would have felt comfortable being my friend. It was by kind of becoming part of the whatever quote mainstream American culture. I was able to integrate in, and the line I use in relationship to the African American experience is, in Europe, Jews couldn't pass for white, whatever that meant. In America, we could, sort of. And went at it hammer and tongs. My mom was she wanted to be just generic American, whatever that was, and did a pretty good job of it. She even lost her New York accent over time. And it wasn't until she was very old and she ended up in a senior living facility. It was run by a Jewish community that my brother and I found for her. She said, "I guess I'm just a little old Jewish lady from New York," and we were like, "Duh," right? And that's okay to be who it is. But at the time, there weren't many choices. I feel much, and I started Arlington. I didn't think about it at the time. As it became more diverse, I felt more comfortable. I also lost what little traces I had of my Southern accent, which I had developed when I went to college. My nickname was Redneck because I was from Virginia, and I thought you guys had no. I was in Connecticut. You have no idea. But I did have a white Southern accent, and that's pretty much gone. I still kind of miss some of that part of Arlington's culture. I would say over time, the Southern part of Arlington's cultures have disappeared. If you talk to Joan Mulholland, I believe you've met her. Joan's from Arlington. And she's got a very thick speech, and she teases me and says, "So you're still a Yankee," and she gives you chicory coffee. And she grew up in Buckingham. Though she told me that when she grew up, and she said she thought it affected her politics in a way, was there were a lot of Jewish families in Buckingham. And I thought, okay, why? And she said, because Buckingham was one of the few places that allowed Jews and Muslims, there weren't many Muslims, to live, and she had a lot of Jewish neighbors, and most of whom had come down from the Northeast. And a lot of Jewish people in this country tend to be liberal, given it protects us, our values. And I didn't know until till I talked to Joan and looked up to it. There were restrictive covenants all over this county, now unenforceable, restricting Italian, Jewish, Muslim, Black, and Latino. One of my friends in Arlington, her mom, she's Latino, and their family came here in the 1920s. Her parents had to get married in D.C. because there were laws you couldn't have interracial marriage, and the Mexican was her mom, or I guess it was her grandmom, married an Italian guy, Catholic, and had to get married in D.C. rather than in Virginia, where it would have been technically illegal. That must have been in the 40s. I mean, you know, that they kind of, and she told me that growing up they had to get their, you know, the Hispanic foods in the district. There was nothing here. You know, now it's like next door, across the street. You know, times have changed. Food, the big thing, and it's only half a joke, is from when I grew up, the food here is much better than when I was growing up. There was hot shops. There was one or two Chinese restaurants in all Northern Virginia. There was a place called Steak in the Sack that was Arab food in Bailey's Crossroads. We're done. You know, everything else was diners and, you know, steak and chicken and, you know, what's considered American food. A couple places Italian. That was it. And now you name the cuisine, we pretty much got multiple choices for it. And I happen to like that, you know. And so.
Yeah, I'm glad that like that option that you know that exists now, this diversity, because as one of the people that you mentioned, you know, she stated that you don't feel different because everybody's different, and it's nice to celebrate that difference and that diversity and to be yourself. And yeah, it's great that you have it now here in Arlington versus when you were a kid.
Yeah, it feels safer, you know. When I used to go further out in Virginia, I didn't really have much trouble. And because I sounded like other, I mean, I really can talk like this all day. I don't anymore. And I'm living with someone who grew up in New York. So it kind of was a non-issue. But I feel, you know, when I walk up and down the Pike, you know, or even in my own neighborhood, there's people from everywhere. And we all just kind of, there's this unspoken attitude of we just need to get along. One of the women we interviewed for the Transitions book is a family is Palestinian. And she has this wonderful line, you don't have to be, you know, homogeneous to be harmonious. And that this diversity actually has a strength. And you can just be who you are. Nobody's going to bother you for it. And there are some ethnic enclaves in the area, but generally not. People are all mixed up. I mean, Dewey Tron on our team talks about the apartment building he used to live in, and, you know, going down the hallway and to smell all the different food. It'll be Ethiopian and, you know, arepas from Colombia, and, you know, you smell curry from somewhere else, and, you know, the spice mixes from Ethiopia, and it's all in one hall. And you just kind of, people weren't bothering each other, they accepted each other. And I find that it makes life better. You know, it's more fun, and I think it's kind of, at least for some of us, part of our identity that we feel comfortable with. Several people I've interviewed and talked to in general speak about that. They feel more comfortable here when they go to an area that's less diverse in the country, that's a little off-putting and not used to it. You know, you go to a place where there's just one or two ethnic groups, it feels a little weird. You know, it's part of who we are. I worry that, I know the county is actively trying to keep its diversity. It's a matter of civic pride. I think that's imbued into the fabric of who we are. Economics may dictate otherwise. I'm kind of concerned about that. A line I think about from my father, who was not in this business, he said, over time, developers always get what they want. And I'm concerned about that. Developers are creative at what they do, but their primary driver is profit. And the profit, though it has its place and it creates wealth, is not the only value a community needs. And I'm concerned about, and you know, the profits are huge, potentially huge. Also, these big businesses coming here because of access to the Capitol and the Pentagon, they have their needs, you know, as businesses and for their employees. That's going to change the demographics of the community. I think something Takis Karantonis, who was here earlier, said one of the things he thought about Arlington's diversity, which I think was in action in the period that we're discussing, was that architecturally it's kind of uninteresting here. This is not Old Town Alexandria even, right? It's kind of generic strip development in most of the county. And so people felt they could just come in and fit in, and they weren't disturbing how things were. They could fit in. And that seems to have worked. I do worry that Arlington, there are developers in this community who would pave their mama's graves, for a buck. And it's also some of it changes beyond beyond individual control. I think about the big change in Arlington actually happened in the 1930s and 40s during the New Deal, when Arlington went from being a very rural community to being a suburb. Most of the area we're living in now and seeing, except for the place across the street, was built in the 30s or early 50s to house new government workers as the government expanded during the war and under Roosevelt and Truman and Eisenhower. All these garden apartments and lots of small, all the Arlington Forest and all the brick ramblers that got built there in the colonials, that got built to house the new workers in places like Buckingham and Colonial Village and Arlington Village and Barcroft, etc. Buchanan Gardens were all built in that era. My grandfather on my mother's side was in Arlington briefly during World War I, when he came here in the 60s and was shocked because he remembered it being rural. Early on in the Pike project that we did, I didn't interview, but talked to a man who was in his late 90s who was baptized on the Pike around 1920, maybe even earlier. And he remembered the Pike still being gravel, not paved. So things, I feel nostalgia for this earlier time, but people older than me, or many of whom aren't around anymore, had strong memories of a very, very different community. Arlington has changed a lot, and I think some of it's just going to be driven by what happens in the things, forces far beyond our borders. For example, Arlington didn't bring Vietnamese people here. It happened because of something several thousand miles away because of a war. Same with the Central American, immigration. Same with Ethiopian. The famines and bad government situations drove people to exile, and they found a safe home here. But that wasn't something we did. Something that was said to me by a former county board member was that, one of the changes was Clarendon used to be heavily Vietnamese. We used to call it the Ho Chi Minh Trail, sometimes Little Saigon. When we documented the Pike in 79, 80, that area's solid Vietnamese. There must have been a couple dozen stores and restaurants, and all the posters on the wall were in Vietnamese. They left. I don't even know if there's a Vietnamese business left there anymore. Maybe one restaurant. I'm not even sure of that. They, through internal machinations within the community and needs, the people moved to the Eden Center over near Seven Corners, which is also still undergoing change. And a lot of the community, there are still Vietnamese in Arlington, but most moved, out into Fairfax County, Loudoun, Prince William. Dewey on our team, Tron, is still here, but Mimi Ho, who came to the Pike from Laos, of Vietnamese background, moved when she got married, and she and her husband got kids. They bought a house in Loudoun County because they couldn't afford a place with a yard and enough room for their children in Arlington. they're middle class, but their middle class money, they didn't have inherited family wealth either. Her husband's black. They didn't have the kind of money that it would take to put a down payment on a cheap house in Arlington for $700,000. That's a lot of money. You can buy a condo for $300-400, but you can't have kids in it. That takes some wealth to do. And I think it's going to change, like I said, the economic demographics of the community. We're seeing it now. So.
Yeah, it's interesting how it's kind of economic and kind of like racial, because certain demographics, economic wise, have more money, and then some of them typically don't. But it's interesting to think about. I'm also worried about the diversity shrinking here too, and it's sad, but realistically speaking, there's always going to be like a force beyond our control, unfortunately. I wish.
We still build the community as, our sponsoring organization, Columbia Pike Partnership, still uses that phrase. Came up by Audrey Singer, a demographer who wrote in our first book, World in a Zip Code. She did paper for a think tank. And they're still using that phrase, world in zip code. It's still very diverse compared to most of the world, but it's visible to me how different it is. And I see that it's accelerating. Though we're still, interestingly, getting influxes. It's not done yet because we're still getting a large influx from Mongolia, still moving in. Part of that's moving within Arlington out of the River House complex in Roslyn, but still some are coming, mostly at the eastern end of the Pike. And there seem to be still quite a few Afghans coming as people are slowly through refugee groups. I know that because I do work for Ethiopian Community Development Council, and they're doing a lot of refugee. Friday, I'm photographing Afghan refugees, though they're not mostly being settled in Arlington anymore. If they come here without funding, because there's no money. People are being settled in West End Alexandria, which is Condo Canyon. It's a little less expensive, or in Maryland. Though I do see a fair Afghan presence here. Most of our Somali community has left. The Bangladeshi community, which here is large, is slowly trickling out, though a lot of those folks are in IT, and they may stay, because it pays well. And IT does seem to be competency based. My partner Ruth is an IT project manager for federal government, and I'd say, from what she tells me and what I can hear on her Zoom meetings, team meetings, that a good probably half of the work staff she works for is South Asian, and some Middle Eastern, and some from the former Soviet Union, and some Chinese. But those are it's interesting that they're quite diverse, and the South Asians are, Sikh, Hindu, Muslim, non-religious, they're not all one either. So some Buddhist. So that world will stay diverse, but they're going to be wealthier. It's a different creature. And I worry, and the county's worried, and has taken efforts, through some of the housing agencies like APA, Arlington Partnership for Affordable Housing, AHC, and then the Gerald Lynch, which is redoing Barcroft. They've managed to, they've been, I think, sincere about trying to preserve affordable housing. But to me, once you start having to engineer that, it shows you've kind of half lost the battle, because the market rates are going up. Though we don't know over a long time. I've seen a lot of predictions that world population is going to drop over the next 50, 60 years radically. Particularly as women get educated, they tend to want smaller families. We'll see but that's going to not be in my lifetime, probably, or even yours. So, but I think what began in that period we're talking about, and culminated in this peak of diversity that I think probably peaked about a dozen years ago, is a good way for the world to be. It creates peace. Lara Ajami and I, and if we were back where our families, I have family in Israel, on my both, definitely on my father's side, I believe on my mother's side, though I'm not in contact with them. She's from Damascus, Syria. If we're in the Mideast, we quite truthfully cannot speak to each other. We'd be over barbed wire, shouting across. You couldn't do it. The two countries are in a Cold War with each other. Here we're friends. I would never have met Mimi and Dewey and Sushmita had this community not been open to and welcoming to immigration. Or Moises Gomez, who was entertainment from South America, all of whom are friends, colleagues, just great people, and work together as artists. And we don't spend a lot of time amongst ourselves actually talking about those issues, because it's kind of like we don't need to. And we may talk about it in a relationship who we need to cover, but internally, not that much. Dewey talks to me about some things that his parents, particularly his father, had to go through when he came to America, the discrimination he experienced and the traumas he had experienced in Vietnam that remind me of some of the mannerisms of my own father, who didn't speak about what had happened in Germany. But they're kind of very personal rather than global. We didn't talk that much about the Black community here. That I am more familiar with that in Arlington at the time, though it wasn't directed at me, but I did go into Black communities to photograph, and obviously had some students, mostly in Halls Hill and in the Valley. In the Valley, I was taken around by John Robinson, a community activist. There's now a plaza named after him. I got turned on to him by one of my students, Roz Moore. And, the law had changed, but they still all lived in one area. And the small businesses they had, they were very proud of. There was a history of those folks being harassed that I heard from the horse's mouth. Dr. Muse, had Green Valley Pharmacy, he was treated very badly by the police and banks and other places. Which he would talk about, though he was a quiet man. John talked to me about it. That I remember being asked to come to photograph at rallies to promote Martin Luther King's birthday as a holiday at the old Drew School, that I did photograph, and there was still, they needed that. That hadn't happened yet. It's important. I remember going up into Halls Hill. John was my entree into Green Valley, so I was able to meet people not just on the street. Up in Halls Hill, I walked around a lot. It was considered weird. I was called Nerve I'd met sort of gang kids, because they weren't used to white people walking around there. And I was just kind of like, hey, how you doing? And I remember guys talking about rivalries with the white gangs. There were white, Cherrydale boys and whatnot, would get into tussles with the black gangs. There were white gangs in Arlington. The worst of that was before my time. There apparently was a shootout at Lee Harrison Shopping Center between two white motorcycle gangs. That's before my time here. Also, when the Asians first came in here, there were Asian youth gangs. Dewey Tron could talk about them more. Little LAB, you'd see graffiti, Little Asian Boys, or a couple others. There were some Latino gangs, LLL, Little Latin Locos, and a couple of others. I don't see that presence anymore. It may be there. Dewey would know more than me. But just where Harris Teeter is, there used to be High Q Billiards, which was kind of the rough end of the Vietnamese world would hang out there. There were murders and gang fights there in late 70s, early 80s. I mean, that dissipated as the Vietnamese community began to, establish itself economically and culturally in the area. Those issues became less critical. Also, I think the county did a pretty good job of recognizing they needed to work with youth to integrate them. Gangs were causing problems, and I know that was Paula Endo's project that I volunteered with was helpful to youth. I mean, Dewey says it saved his life. Next door, we have Cafe Cezanne, the woman who designed that, what came out of that program, Adriana Torres. Her mom owns the hair shop next door. There, that give folks something to do. I don't know how integrated it was through all the county systems, but there seemed to have been an understanding that we don't want this to fester.
Wow, that's so interesting. And besides being a professional photographer who has worked with a lot of esteemed publications such as The Washington Post, People Magazine, National Geographic Society Explorer Magazine, and has received numerous photography and community service awards, you're also an educator. As you noted, you worked as an adjunct professor at Northern Virginia Community College, Nova, from 2006 to 2007, and at George Mason University in 2003. You taught photography with Arlington Public Schools from 1976 to 1981, and from 1983 to 1985, and taught at other places as well, other schools. What role did the arts have during 1976 to 1990?
That's the hardest question. I've always kind of worked outside of the quote fine art world. Arlington, and we've had the Arlington Arts Center. Paula and I showed there in 1981. This is a personal thing. I find the quote art world pretty silly. It's like a high school clique. I do feel arts are very important in a community, but a lot of people kind of play at it, and that's not me. There hasn't been a lot of community-based art in Arlington. There are a lot of good individual artists here. There are institutions that are helpful. I've kind of stayed out of that world, except when I felt it was important for the work to be shown to the community. Working with Sushmita, who has very similar values about that is important to me. Arlington now has public arts program. We didn't really have one at one time. That's Angela Adams. I have my disagreements with some of the choices she's made, but it's very important. She's done a lot of good work in that area too. She and her staff have really helped create an identity. I know some of the county board has cared for it. A line that someone said to me years ago said that, the signature of a community is the arts. That though a community needs, engineers and accountants and teachers and Lord knows every other profession, medicine, to get by, what remember a community for often is its arts. We think of, ancient Greece, of the Parthenon, and the plays were written, those artists were supported by those economic actors. But what we remember of the community is the arts that come out of them. When you think of, Persia, you think of the miniatures and the great poets, and not so much, and the great architecture, not so much, the military or the water systems, though those are critical. And I think that's true in our community too. Arlington doesn't have, I think partly because of the immigrant population, doesn't have a strong essential identity, not like our sister to the south, Alexandria, which has a much clearer sense of its own history. Arlington's only 103 years old, and it formed of people moving in. Not most population, like government workers, comes from elsewhere. Doesn't have long roots here, except the black community and some of the older white community. but particularly the Black community. So there is no focus about what art is here, and because there's so many groups, I mean, I know we have some amazing Mongolian artists, but their art tends to be about Mongolia. There's the Bolivian dance troupes here are stunning, though they're moving out of the county. They're very good within their area. And other, etc. I mean, the library system has done a lot to foster it. I don't think we've had a handful of great musicians to come out of here. Punk rock scene, Roberta Flack, the great soul singer, comes from Arlington, but she's not really identified with Arlington, I think. You know, and her mom apparently was a teacher here. Don Zintera, the great Inner Ear Studios recording is here. And others. You know, we've had some, you know, actors, actresses who came out of here, Shirley MacLaine, Mark Beatty, but they're not identified with Arlington. Maybe the punk rock a little bit. Dave Grohl, though he's Springfield. I think art has a role to play in society. I sometimes get mad at artists who think we are deserved. You know, we're supposed to be supported. I have gotten grants, but I make my living doing commercial art. You know, there is a role for the market in it, and we just have to make it value. People will vote with their feet, with their dollars. If it's valuable to them, they'll support it, either institutionally or buying it. There's not a little, you know, to me, art in Arlington is, at least in Clarendon, it's like, you know, the newest beer. You know, it's, you know, a coffee shop. It's not really art. But like I said, I tend to avoid the quote art scene, though I'm doing a studio tour this weekend because I was asked to, and I thought, okay, I'll do it. But I find that, like I said, it reminds me of junior high school. It's cliquish. And if the art doesn't have soul and muscles, you know, and vertebra that integrate into the community, who cares? You know. I also do work that's outside of Arlington very much. So the next project I do is about klezmer musicians, which is, I don't know. Well, actually, we have one klezmer musician in Arlington. He's in the Army band. But it's not, that work is international. It's scope. I don't, you know, I think the work we've done in our own project will have meaning, though it has historic meaning as well as aesthetic. I do think, though, it's important that a community foster the arts for its own sake, because it's good for us as individuals to, you know, to be involved in creative activity. But that's a personal value.
Yeah, I completely agree. And you know, that was our last question, but if you have any other thoughts you wanted to add to conclude with this interview?
Well, thank you. I am glad to help. I'm very proud of our community, what we've done here. We have a lot to do. It's a long way from perfect. There's still historical legacies that need to be rectified, of injustice, discrimination. I will continue to do my part as an artist and citizen to foster equality and fairness going forward, and to continue welcoming and people of diverse background and their expressions. I think that's important. I think we need to be honest about our past, which is not always so pretty. I think counties within the county pretty good about that. Not perfect, but pretty good. We're to be, I think, commended for removing Confederate names from things, or could be commended for being the first community to integrate schools in the county, and doing some to help our Black community who move forward. I think we still have a lot of work to do, and it'll come over time, I hope, to through arts and other means get the stories and expressions of our newer citizens, some of whom are not so new at this point. Been here, the Vietnamese community's been here almost 50 years. And to get those stories out. And I look forward to that, and I thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. We really appreciate it. You're